Hi, everyone. Brian Valerio, Senior Vice President in the Advisory Group at Alliance Advisors. And today I'm joined by Kristina Veaco of the Veaco Group. Chris specializes in working with boards on doing board evaluations so that they can make sure that they are meeting their investors' expectations and are as effective as possible. So, Chris, can you start the conversation by talking about the different types of boards that you work with? I understand that you don't just work with public companies, but there's a bunch of different types of boards that you help do some evaluations. So can you walk us through that?
Of course, Brian, and it's true that we work with all kinds of boards, public, private, company, nonprofit boards. We've done some pension funds and retirement fund boards. The size of the organization will vary, but for the most part, these are like mid-sized or larger organizations.
And how does your approach kind of vary for the different boards?
Well, each board is unique in some way. We first want to learn what we can about the company or the organization and the board and why we're being brought in at this time. Is there a particular area of focus? Because sometimes a board will bring you in because there's something that they want brought to the surface, and having a third party come in helps them to do that. So is there a particular area of focus? Is the composition of the board changing? What's going on with the company or the organization? And the way we get to that is we hold interviews with the board leadership and typically the board chair or the chair of the nominating and governance committee. And then frequently with the CEO and the general counsel and the corporate secretary, sometimes the CFO. And in public companies, of course, we have access to the SEC filings. Once engaged, we often have access to board materials and the agendas. Sometimes we're given access to the board portal, not in all cases, but it can be very helpful. Then we develop questions that are tailored to each particular board in each situation, along with some questions that we typically ask all board members. We like to use a combination of written questions and then oral interviews with directors, and we prefer comments and we don't like to use ratings if we can avoid it. The oral interviews give board members the opportunity to speak candidly and confidentially with us, more so with us than they would be with management or even a board colleague. And then conversely, we're able to speak more candidly with the board when presenting our results or giving individual feedback. You know, we're looking for what the board is doing well as any opportunities for improvement. I really like to include director self-assessments, which gives each director the opportunity to explore anything that director needs to be more effective. It could be related to their committee assignments, or often we'll hear that a director would like more education about a particular topic. And we also conduct peer reviews if the board wants them. Let me just define that for the audience. For those who don't know, peer reviews are when each board member is given the opportunity to comment constructively on the effectiveness of each of their colleagues.
So there's a lot to unpack there, but let's start with kind of the last point about the peer reviews. Are you finding that this is something that more and more boards are utilizing? Is this process that's increasing in regularity among the boards that you're working with, at least?
I think it is. I think in part that's why we get the calls that we do to do the board evaluation, because they recognize the value in this. Not all boards are ready for it, and that's fine. But those that are, and I think that number is increasing, they want constructive feedback. They really want to take a look at how to make themselves better. And I think, again, as I mentioned, it allows for greater candor on the part of the directors.
Well, that's the part that really, struck me when you were talking before about, when you're brought in, how sometimes you're brought in specifically because there is an issue, or that, when you're brought in, people are more willing to talk to you than they would be to talk to each other potentially.
Yeah.
So when you're having these candid conversations with the different constituents that you mentioned, and you learn that a director is performing less than what's expected of them. What's the process after that knowledge is gained?
I should point out that can come up even if we're not doing peer reviews. If there's someone who's not fully engaged or behaving badly in the boardroom, we hear about that regardless of whether or not we're doing peer reviews. But when those kinds of issues come up, I always try to explore, if it's possible, what is the basis for that? For example, there may be something going on in the director's life that is causing them to have to pull back from the board, and they haven't talked about it yet. But it's it's kind of known. So I try to explore that and really try to understand it. And at the end of the day, though, it's really important that these kinds of issues be raised with the chair of the Nominating and Governance Committee and or the board chair if that's what the company wants or if that's what the board wants. Typically, these people are already aware of these issues. But the evaluation process serves as a vehicle to allow for the beginning of a conversation with that director, to allow for some correction. And it could eventually be relevant to the renomination process.
So when you're doing these evaluations, you talk to a number of different boards. Have you started to see some common themes or topics develop in these conversations and in these evaluations that you're conducting?
Yes. I think given my experience, we have started to propose some common topics because we know that these are areas that need to be explored. So some of those include board dynamics and board culture, the board management communications, and board processes. For example, is the board getting the information it needs to do its job? And we always explore whether or not board members are on the same page with respect to the priorities of the board and of the company for the next 3 years or the next year, which is often related to the strategy. But there are going to be other topics that relate specifically to that board and that company. Some boards are taking a closer look at their committees and the committee responsibilities, for example.
So the committees are something that seems to be evolving. There's a number of public companies are establishing ESG committees, and board composition and board succession planning is another thing that institutional investors are really interested in. I hear it a lot on engagement calls with public companies. So is the board composition and succession planning, is that part of the evaluation, or should it be part of the board's evaluation when they're conducting this type of analysis?
It can be, Brian. One of the areas that we touch on, given the current strategy of the organization, is whether the board has the right skills and competencies on the board. Do they have the right board members for this time, given what's going on with the organization, in the industry? Do they need to add to the current board, or as they look ahead, maybe there's a board member who's going to be retiring shortly. The point is, what should they be looking for to enhance the board's effectiveness? The key, in my mind, is to have a group of people who, as a whole, are capable of providing the necessary oversight and guidance to the company. That doesn't necessarily mean that someone has to step down to make room for new competencies, although it can. But the size of you can expand the size of the board for a short time if need be. The key is that the process be an orderly and thoughtful one.
So how often is this process done? How often should it be done? In your experience, what are you seeing from companies? What are you advising companies on in terms of how frequently they should engage in this type of thorough board evaluation?
Well, it's going to depend on the board and the company. I've seen I think the usual rhythm is that the boards will bring in a third party to do kind of a deep dive in 1 year. And then they'll go back to some in-house form for the next couple of years, either with a colleague on the board or perhaps an in-house process before bringing the governance consultant back. I think in part it's going to depend on what is raised, what comes up during the board evaluation. I'm working with the board now that they want us to come back not even a year later, just to see if, to check in with people, and they like having the third party do that. But I've also seen boards use a third party to conduct its evaluation every year because of the perspective and the objectivity that the third party consultant can bring. And it saves company resources because this is a process that if done in-house, takes a lot of time and energy. But regardless of who conducts the evaluation, it's important not to have a rote process that you're using the same questions and asking, them to give ratings it's just, they get bored. So changing the process from time to time is important. And for public companies, it's really important that they disclose the process. This typically in the proxy statement, whether a third party has been used, investors are calling for using a third party for the evaluation from time to time. I think they recognize that we come in and bring a different perspective. We take a fresh look at things and can offer information back to the board that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise,
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that really echoes the statements that you hear from institutional investors about this type of process and why it is important to have another perspective come in and assist with the evaluation. So if companies are new to this and they haven't conducted or haven't brought in a third party to do an analysis of the board and look at the effectiveness of the board members, what are some things that they should be considering when looking at doing this type of evaluation?
Well, I'm biased, Brian, but I think it's important to look for a governance expert, someone who's been in the boardroom, someone who knows what directors need to be effective and what management needs to do to support the board. Someone who's worked with a variety of boards will bring wide experience about what works. And some boards value having that person also be a lawyer in the event the attorney-client privilege would apply. And I always like to point out that as lawyers, we are trained to listen. And I think that's the key in a board evaluation, is to have someone who's going to really listen to what your directors are saying. It's so important. My colleague, Sherry Sorokin, and I wrote an article on this subject a while ago, some things to consider. It's on my website, on my Veaco Group website, but also just Google what to look for when hiring a governance consultant. It's at the top of the search.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your thoughts on what some of the best practices are when conducting board evaluations. I know this is something that a lot of my clients are interested in as they do, whether it's the annual board evaluation that's done in-house or periodic board evaluations where they bring in an outside third party to assist with that prospects. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I hope we can connect again soon.
My pleasure, Brian. Thanks for the opportunity.